Welcome to another episode of Million Dollar Stories, where we get to interview authors all over the world. I try to learn something from every single one of our guests, and this talk is all about leadership to some extent, I guess. So I think you guys are in for a real treat. The book that we're starting off with, he has many books, but the one that I want to talk about first is called The Global Leadership Challenge. And I really never thought about the difference between global leadership and domestic leadership. There's probably some things that you can take from this and apply to your own business, no matter how big or small. So it is an honor to have you here, Alan Morrison. Thank you so much, man.
Mike's good to be here. Good to chat with your audience. You got a great deal going on here with your $1 million book promotion, and I love it. Good work.
Thanks, thank you. Yeah, you're an author and you have 13 books. I'm assuming that you found how beneficial it is to just keep writing. The more you write, the more you can serve your audience. But I think in this book, you interviewed over 300 different leaders. Is that right?
Yeah, the book is now in its third edition, and so it's gone through a metamorphosis over time and been updated and new examples and new insights. And what we focus on in the book, the Global Leadership Challenge, is first off the need that we have for global leaders, and then the difference between domestic and global leaders, and then what are in fact the competencies of effective global leaders, and then how do we develop those competencies.
Okay.
And what we found is in terms of the need for global leaders, the world is becoming, despite all nationalism and so on, we are more integrated as a planet than we've ever been in the history of mankind. And so the ability of companies to grow is stymied if all you do is focus on domestic markets. So as companies want to grow, they want to access new technologies, new ideas. They want to access the best talent that's out there. Companies need to be out in the world and in order to serve their customers or to serve their shareholders. And so the people who can bring companies out in the world and operate in that multicultural, politically complicated environment requires some different skills.
Yeah, and I've seen amongst my clients and in myself particularly, we are sort of global, right? I have virtual assistants that are scraping data for me in the Philippines. Some people work for me in Romania when it comes to video editing. So it doesn't mean that you have to be a trillion-dollar company to become global. No. This can be anybody, anywhere, realizing the power is at your fingertips. Is that right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, historically, it was big multinational companies, who set up branch offices in 30, 40 countries around the world. And that's still happening today. But small companies, 4, 8, 12 employees, like Mike, just like you said, you're accessing talented people from the Philippines or from India, for wherever it is in the world, and having to not just communicate, but relate to those people, motivate those people, understand what's going on in their lives. That requires some unique skills and attitudes.
I have a client who's a multi-millionaire, and he said to me one pretty scary, scary statement. He said that if someone were to give me $1 million business and it was cash flowing $1 million a month, but I had no way of implementing virtual assistants ever in the company, I wouldn't do it, simply because it would require too much effort. And the fact of having virtual assistants gives me a competitive advantage in the marketplace to grow the company. When I heard that, it made me think of it in a different light. And I said, you know what, maybe he is onto something here, that if you start to think outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, United States, into other parts of the world where their work ethic is superior to the average person in the United States, you can really reap rewards. So assuming this is catching on, is that right?
Yeah, actually, what you kind of bring up is the intersection of two different kind of dynamics that we're facing now, and I don't think it's going to diminish going forward. The one dynamic is technology change, innovation, and the other dynamic is globalization. And so, as a leader in an organization, you cannot compete effectively unless you are able to embrace those two different dynamics, which are codependent. We can't have technology change. We can't afford to pay for it unless we're amortizing it around the world. and any technology advantage provides even small companies with a competitive advantage. So the world and technology, globalization and innovation have really come together over the past 10 or 15 years, which puts enormous pressure on leaders. How do you make sense of all of that complexity around you? And it's not an easy task for leaders.
Is it a major transition to go from being a domestic leader to a global leader? And I think you're right that we're becoming more global than ever. We're becoming more interconnected with other countries. That could cause a problem because you see individuals, and they're known as globalists, that try to run the world rather than try to help out certain groups of people. So is it a major transition? Is that what you basically outline in the book of how to do it the right way?
Well, we do talk about how to do it the right way, but I think ultimately it comes down to also personal choice or corporate choice. Many people, who are confronted by this complexity, they decide to limit their exposure to it. They say, look, there's only so much that I can attend to. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to decide I'm going to stay focused on Pittsburgh or Pennsylvania or the US East Coast. And that's okay. There's nothing necessarily or inherently wrong with that. But with those kinds of choices, you also limit the company. You limit over the long term the ability of the company to understand what's happening around the world. Remember, the US marketplace is only about 22% of the world's market. So if you decide you're going to focus on the Northeast United States, as big a market as that is, you're going to be restricted to, I don't know, 8% of the potential market for your product or service. It's not a bad call, but it's also a limiting call. Not only does it limit you in terms of market, but if all you're focused on is that region, you don't pick up on what's happening with new products, new technologies, new services, new providers who are popping up around the world, who are in many ways much more competitive than you are. So if we take, for example, electric vehicles, okay, that market, you could look at that market and say, well, it's a U.S. market, and it's a big market in the U.S., although it is flattening out. But you would miss what's happening in China, where we have EV producers who are making cars 30% cheaper than in the United States. And if you put on your blinders and you said, well, we're all about the U.S. consumers, oh, God bless you. But you're going to miss what's happening in China, and how if you imported some of that technology, some of that manufacturing prowess into the US, you're going to miss out on that. And in the long run, you cannot remain competitive unless you become more global in your orientation.
It's a great
so
point.
these are some choices that companies make: short term, long term. And many of us can just continue along for the next generation, keeping our head kind of, under the covers and focusing on our little world. That's all totally fine. But I would argue that over time, we have to become more global as companies, or we just are not going to remain competitive.
Man, you make me think of what just happened here with U.S. Steel being bought out by Nippon Steel, right?
Right. Nippon Steel.
Nippon, yeah.
If that goes through.
If that goes through. Okay, so it's pretty close to going through. But what we're able to kind of analyze when it comes to U.S. Steel is they're losing out because I think they have regulations in place, they have unions in place that they just can't compete against the global companies, which means now they're going down the tubes unless maybe, like you said, they think globally and adjust accordingly. Is that your philosophy?
Yeah, short term, long term. And what politicians in Washington naturally focus on is short term.
Right.
And yet if we try to isolate the United States, focus on short term, in the long run, and we see this with the hollowing out of many industries in Europe, for example, that over time, over the generation that it takes, the country becomes less competitive, less affluent, growth slows. So these are choices that we have to make as politicians, as as business leaders, and ultimately as consumers.
So I'm with you on this so far. Usually when I hear any type of globalist agenda, I'm like, oh, that's not good. But what you're saying to me is, okay, and let me get your thoughts on, minimum wage and certain regulations and certain environmental regulations that they're implementing here that other countries will never abide by, which gives them the ultimate advantage in the global market, right?
Yeah,
So what
yeah.
are your thoughts on all of that?
I mean, ultimately, there is an intersection between economics and values. Not everything is for sale. There are some principles I think that we, as Americans or people more generally, we adhere to, or at least aspire to. We want to treat people decently, but in terms of economics, the more we think we are doing good by raising minimum wages, the less we are creating opportunities for the advantaged or the disadvantaged or undereducated, and we price them out of the marketplace. So, some people benefit, but many people lose their jobs. And even those who benefit in the short term, yeah, I got a pay raise from $12 to $15 an hour. Behind the scenes, the store managers are scheming of ways to get rid of those people and replace them with technology. So, again, short term, long term, we think, and no one could argue with the nobility of raising the disadvantaged, but we do so over time, I think, at their disadvantage. We create fewer opportunities for them, fewer pathways forward. I think ultimately, as Americans, we have to balance values with our belief, I hope, in free markets. And we have to, I think, experience over centuries has taught us that, generally speaking, free markets create more opportunities than regulated markets.
Bingo.
That's not to suggest there isn't a place for some regulation over some issues to kind of dampen down the potential huge negative consequences of just free markets run amok. But let's try to limit those, recognizing that in the long run, it's free markets are going to make much better decisions than the government will.
Yeah, you seem like a fan of Adam Smith. Is that right? You like Adam Smith's
I
teaching?
am a fan of Adam Smith. I do recognize that the companies they do need some restrictions. If we had no restrictions, we would have collusion. We would have huge consolidation in industries. We'd have monopolies. We would have egregious environmental degradation and so on. But let's keep those limited to the point that we still have the free market working and churning through these decisions.
Love it. Yeah, I'm with you on this so far. Okay, so I look at these companies that really make an impact on this world, and I look at the hedge funds that pretty much own the majority. When you're talking about leaders, I love how you say about the core values and unbreakable values that they will not shake, and that's unbuyable. When you interviewed some of these top leaders, are they, for the most part, the ones who do a lot of good in the world? Are they unbuyable? Do they have core values that they will not break no matter what?
Well, one would like to think so, but sadly not in many cases. We see this we see this from two perspectives. One is in how the companies are managing their operations, but we also see it in the personal lives of the leaders, who many people look to as role models, but in their personal lives, they may not be the best role models in every instance. Now, I think where this really comes to a head, it's certainly from the perspective of corporations, is in China. And so we have, whether they are coerced values or deeply felt values of companies like Disney or Apple, or big companies that we respect, blue chip companies, who have over time developed norms and certain values which they preach, they espouse, they adhere to. But when they go to China, giant market, those values seem to be more malleable. And so when you ask, do companies hold to these values? Yes, so long as there's oversight. And by the way, social media, the internet is a great form of oversight, because what the company says or does in one part of the world is picked up almost instantaneously around the world. It's hard to keep secrets, which is good. But when it comes to China, there's a lot of compromising going on.
Now, was there one or two leaders that you analyzed that really stood up above the rest and you admired their qualities? And maybe there's something that they're doing that our listeners and viewers would, it'd be in their best interest to adopt some of these habits. Anything that stands out in your mind?
I would, rather than cite a couple of individuals, because I think would hold them up maybe beyond their peers. There are a lot of very good leaders out there, but and some bad ones, obviously, as in all walks of life. I think the leaders that do it right are the ones who can connect emotionally with their employees. These are leaders who get out there instead of I'll give you a comparison.
Sounds like Elon Musk, by the way, right out of the gate. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah. So what we have is one leader, and I won't use his name, but it's in the book. He'd been to Japan 20 times for business. His approach was he didn't speak Japanese. He didn't really want to be in Japan. He would take the corporate jet to Japan. He'd fly in, get picked up at the airport, taken to his Western hotel where he could watch Western television. Got picked up in the morning by company car, taken to the office, spoke English all day long, and at the end of the week couldn't wait to get out of there to fly back home. He didn't connect with any employees. He couldn't feel what they feel, see what they see. He couldn't interact with them. Compare that with another leader who goes out, goes into the field, has meals with the employees, meals with the customers, visits even customers in their homes to interview them, to see how they live. That ability to really absorb the other culture, the lives and expectations and feelings of employees or customers, that goes an awful long way to maintaining high ethical standards and being able to motivate employees and connect in the long run with the changing markets. So that ability to get outside of yourself, get into the field and think like your employees and customers, that is a hugely important skill, and one that, by the way, arrogant corporate CEOs have a hard time with. Not saying all corporate CEOs are arrogant, but too many of them are.
Well, I would assume you've come across the individuals who were the leaders in their company that they started. I think of Steve Jobs and Wozniak, right? To hand that battalion off to someone who wasn't there in the ground zero days, very difficult. But there is a transition that has to happen. And I would assume that some people really fumble it because it's not their baby. And if they are the CEO and the leader of a company that they didn't start, they might have a different perspective and a different spin on it. But there is a lot of struggle that comes along the way with people buying into that leader. So is there anything that you could teach to our audience that you've seen in great leaders from the people who built it and the handoff to the individual who does take the reins eventually?
Yeah, it's very difficult. In fact, there are relatively few cases of transitional entrepreneurs who build a company to $1 billion to $5 billion, and then either because they realize the limitations of their skills or because they just age out. Okay, their ability to let go, to transition to someone who can continue and maybe even accelerate the change and development of the company. There are very few case studies of that happening. For the most part, they hang on too long, or they pick a weak successor. Weak, maybe they're not even conscious of this, but weak because they don't want to be, they don't want to pale in comparison to their replacement. And so there's very few examples of this. We saw it at Apple. We
Yep.
saw it
The first time, right? I think he
the
gave it to the CEO of
the
Pepsi.
Pepsi,
Right? Yep.
right? Yeah, I'm blanking on his name. It's not not very common. We see that. One other concern in doing this is that the CEOs, the entrepreneurial CEOs, are not necessarily good at picking CEOs. They're not trained in it. They're not talented in it. And if they're successful, often they've got a huge ego. They do not want to delegate, the decisions about CEO succession to someone else. It's all about how they see the world, and so they're not generally good at picking successors either. It's a very, very tough transition.
I was wondering if there's.
I personally would have a hard time replacing a founding, entrepreneurial CEO. That would be a miserably difficult task, because the chances are he's not going away. He remains on the board. He's there kind of looking over your shoulder. And unless you do heroic things, I'm not saying you'll be able to do that. Unless you do that, I don't think you have your half-life, maybe a year or less.
My only assumption is that you have to promote from within, right? To bring an outsider in could be a whole different game, but an insider who grows the company with you and then is handed the ring, if you will, I think that might be the best bet. And I think that's what happened with Tim Cook. I think he was a part of the team for many years. I'm not sure.
He was part of the team.
Yeah.
But Steve Jobs never handed the baton to Cook. That happened later. What I'm saying is that process had been ongoing for a long time, and it didn't happen until after his he was basically out of commission.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I thought it was a process, and it was expected for a long time, but maybe I'm wrong on that. That's interesting.
Yeah,
now,
but also Jobs was not there. Jobs
did he pass away at that time? Okay,
he passed away. So it's not like he's sitting on the board watching all of this happen.
Got it. So he really never did that, because he probably learned his lesson from that first time, huh? Yeah.
I don't. He the last thing he wanted to do was to let go of that company.
Yeah, it makes sense. So I always talk about a cost of transformation, and I think that happens when you go from domestic to global. Case in point, I love wrestling, but there's a wrestling industry or a wrestling company that I pay attention to, AEW, and I noticed that they grew it. Have you ever heard of it?
Yeah.
I love it. All right, so I noticed that they built this tribe, and whenever you have a smaller business, there's a tribe, there's a real community, there's energy behind it.
Right.
But they're probably thinking in bigger terms, right? 5 years from now, we need to be in X, Y, and Z markets. So they started to go in different markets. Now their brand changed a little bit. They presented different things. And my idea was, okay, this just has to happen, right? There's a cost of transformation. They are not really speaking to me anymore. They're speaking to that new network, new area. And so that happens with every company. How can you limit that cost of transformation from really hurting a company?
Yeah, it depends on how well known the foreign activities are to the domestic consumers. So if we could isolate what AEW is doing in Europe, so the American consumer has no idea, couldn't care less, then AEW can basically get away with whatever it wants to do. And what it should do in that case is go after they have to look at channels and distribution and branding and regulations. And there's a lot of differences in how the structure of those markets would work in Europe versus the US. So if they want to be successful in Europe, they need to respond to European realities. Now, to the degree they change that, it's going to impact the brand. And if there's leakage back to the US, then it can undermine the global brand of AEW. So it depends in part, you asked a question about wrestling, but it really comes back to the market dynamics. In some industries, markets are really, kind of isolated to a particular geography, and what works and how it happens. And to be successful in Europe is quite different than Latin America or Europe or Asia or any other part of the world. So it depends. In other markets, they're totally integrated, and the brand is totally global in nature. But even products, like Coca-Cola has 300 plus different brands. Most of those brands are not US brands. They're idiosyncratic to Japan or to Malaysia or France or whatever it is. And they get away with that just fine because the American consumer doesn't really care. But when you take their core brands, the Coca-Colas, the Sprites, and so on, they really have to be consistent with how they're treating those brands and what those brands represent.
So transitioning to your other book, when it comes to creating a business and in the world of being in China, right? I had a client in 2019. He worked with us on his book, and he was telling me about this virus that's happening. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I'm in the United States. Nobody's talking about this stuff, right? But he was telling me during all this craziness in China, he was also saying how difficult it is to grow a business in China. And so whenever I, saw the title of your book, you really do highlight how it's possible, but also there's a chance of really succeeding. So the book that in question here is Enterprise China, accepting or adopting a competitive strategy for business success.
Right.
Is it very difficult for an individual like myself to create a business and penetrate China's market?
It's not for the faint of heart.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. So let me talk about why companies are interested in China, Western companies, and then I'll talk about the problems. Why they're interested in China is really two fundamental reasons. Number one is they're there because they want to access the Chinese market, Chinese consumer. In some industries, it's the largest market in the world. In most other industries, it's the second largest market in the world. So there's a lot of money in China. There's a lot of demand in China, and companies want to go there to grow their business and sell to the Chinese. The second reason they're primarily interested in China is they want to use China as a sourcing base. They want to use China, and China's often called the factory of the world. So they may be in the case where they may be in a situation where they're like, I don't care about China. All I want is cheap toys to sell to my customers. And so we get companies like Walmart that's accessing about 25% of its products from China, or companies like Mattel Toys, which are accessing north of 75% of their toy products are coming from China. So they're on the supply chain side. So those are the two fundamental reasons, and there's kind of intersections. Some companies are there for both. Some are there. Some aren't even quite frankly sure why they're there. They're just there because everyone wants to be there, and they haven't got coherent strategies. After all, there's over 1 million foreign companies that have operations legally organized in China. So hopefully you have a good strategy, you've thought about it, and these are the fundamental reasons. Now, what are the challenges? Well, there's a number of challenges. Number one is, irrespective of all the politics and espionage and all of this stuff, China is just a different market with different languages, different cultural norms. You would have many of the same problems if you were an American company going to, I don't know, India. You don't speak the language. You don't understand how the distribution channels work. You have to set up bank accounts. You have to hire employees. You don't know how to do that. You don't know how to write contracts. There's just an enormous amount of challenge, irrespective of it being China. But China also has some additional challenges. One is the kind of government oversight. In many industries, you're forced to take on a partner. You're forced to share your technologies either with the partner or with the government, and often the government owns a piece of the partner. And so there's this ecosystem in China, and to succeed effectively in China, you need to be connected to that ecosystem of the government, of companies, buyers, suppliers, and so on. And you need to ingratiate yourself in that ecosystem. That's very hard for Western companies to do, and particularly given the dominant role of the government in these enterprises, why we call it enterprise China, is because the government plays a significant role in big company organizations, but also in the 50+% companies that are small or smaller, kind of 100 employees or less. The oversight of the government is constantly there, nurturing, directing, guiding, funding, providing loans, setting up partnerships. It's extremely difficult for Western firms to figure that out and to become insiders in China. In fact, in very, very rare cases have Western companies been able to become insiders in China. A case in point, the largest Chinese company today is Lenovo. Lenovo, computer company. They about 25% of the world's personal computers are Lenovo computers. 25%. They have a big position, but they have dual headquarters. They have a headquarters in the US and a headquarters in China. And quite frankly, they are perceived by the Chinese as probably too American, and by the Americans as probably too Chinese in their orientation. So, if you're going to succeed in China, you need to be Chinese. And I'm not saying that Western companies haven't had a measure of success. They clearly have. But as we talk about in the book, the objective of Chinese, of enterprise China, is to move away from dependency on Western firms to they want to dominate in domestic markets. The Chinese government has been explicit about this. They want Chinese companies to dominate at home, and then they want to go the next step, which is to take Chinese companies and have them and have the rest of the world dependent on Chinese companies. So if you're a Boeing, if you are a Tesla, if you're an Apple computer, you need to understand that what the Chinese end game is not for you to prosper in China. That they want to dominate in China. And the writing is on the wall. They've made this explicit. They've talked about it. They've given speeches about it. They've written about it. They've embedded in their policies. And this is not to suggest the Chinese want to drive these companies out of China. They just want them to become minor players in China. And they've been very explicit about that. So the more Western companies can understand the realities of working in China, does not mean that they should pack up and go home, even though we've seen a fair bit of that over the last couple of years. But it does mean they need to be very well tuned into the longer term objectives and strategy of the Chinese, the CCP.
Got it. Interesting. Yeah. I think it's important for anybody listening or watching to analyze some of these major players, these leaders out there. Some are doing it the wrong way, some are doing it the right way. And I think it's smart to just look into what they're doing so you can combat it in some capacity, or, maybe support it if you're out there and you want to support their mission. So last, I know we're running out of time. You have a meeting here, but one global leader that I always think is doing it in a way that's really scary is Klaus Schwab. All right. And I see what he's putting out there. And it's almost like if you give somebody too much power, you can have them impose their beliefs and views on so many people that really adjust things. But there are other global leaders out there that are doing it the right way. And whether it's within a company or within its, the World Health Organization, I don't think too many people in the World Health Organization are. But is there a leader out there that you really admire and maybe we should look into and say, wow, this guy really does it, or this woman does it the right way? Anybody really inspires you?
Certainly, it may be controversial. I'm always inspired by, almost always inspired by Elon Musk.
Oh, like it. All right.
But I'm inspired because he does not accept the status quo. I'm inspired because he works, his butt off. He's maniacal about his work. He's focused on performance. He is as apolitical as he can be, although I'm worried he's becoming more political.
Oh, there's no doubt in the past 2 years.
He needs to be. I think my advice to him would be careful about that, because it could well be his undoing. If his ego takes hold and he thinks he can do everything in every sphere, including politics, I think it will be his undoing. So I'm greatly in admiration of Elon Musk. He, like all leaders, have a soft or underbelly. He is by no means a perfect leader. He is flawed in many ways, but there is much to admire about Elon Musk, and his general approach to looking after the shareholders and embracing technology.
Yeah.
I like his risk taking. I like his decisiveness. So there's much to like, but again, he is a man who is flawed in many ways. I personally would not want to work work directly for Elon Musk.
Yeah, I'm the same way, but I do admire him. And you could plead the fifth on this last question, but it's 2024, the year of chaos. Anybody who's running for president really embody great leadership qualities on a global scale? Who do you think? Is there anybody you recommend?
I mean, they all do. It's a matter of looking at the positives and weighing them against a often significant list of negatives. And so I look at someone like Donald Trump, and he reminds me in many ways of Elon Musk. But I mean, his list of negatives is extreme and worrisome. I look at Joe Biden. I'm a little struggling to think of the positives, but there's got to be some in there somewhere. I do think he cares about people and the average man and woman on the street, but he's got a big list of negatives. I look at someone like Nikki Haley, and she's got a big list of positives, and she's got negatives. She doesn't understand, I don't think, economics and business, and she's a born and bred politician.
Yep.
I think of DeSantis, and he's got a big list. In fact, I think objectively, he's got the best trade-off between positives and negatives. That the problem with him is he's kind of boring and he's uninspiring.
Yeah.
So he's got negatives. So, but this is what leadership's all about, is balancing positives and negatives, and recognizing that leaders are humans, and there's a mixture of positives and negatives. And my advice, and I've done a lot of coaching and of CEOs from all over the world for representing multi-billion-dollar companies, and my advice is play to your strengths and don't call attention to your negatives. And for the negatives, get someone in or people in who can help offset the negative. So if you're weak in certain areas, delegate to competent people, trust those people. Where leaders get into trouble is they don't even understand their own weaknesses, and they think they're so good that they can just run over their weaknesses and spout off about whatever it is, even though they have not got a bloody clue about it. Bring in people who are competent, trust them, delegate to them, and get the hell out of the way. And if we do that, all of us as leaders, I think, will succeed. Where we're going to run into trouble is if we are not self-aware, and if we're not humble enough to recognize, acknowledge our weaknesses, and get good people in to help.
And you bring up great leadership qualities, and one of which is they have to connect with their audience. And I think Donald does connect with his audience at a level that we haven't seen for many years. So fascinating, man. You could talk with him about UFC fighting, boxing, wrestling. You could probably go down and have a drink with him at the bar, even though he doesn't drink. But that's the way I look at it. So
you could have a Diet Coke with him.
Diet Coke, right? That's exactly right. So you know what? When I saw you on my schedule, I was a little nervous. I saw, is he a globalist? We've connected on many things. I share the same sentiments. So it was an honor to talk with you. Is there any website or social media channel that you recommend for people to check out?
Yeah, I would take a look at my book website, enterprisechina.com, all one word. And when you go to that site, there'll be all kinds of links and so on, and things I'm working on and the leadership. My next project is on politics, organizational politics. Politics at work is the working title, and so I'm super interested in this topic and how politics can overwhelm all of us. But enterprisechina.com, I welcome your viewers, your listeners to check out that site.
Beautiful. So guys, the two books, I mean, he has many of them, but The Global Leadership Challenge and Enterprise China. It is an honor to talk with you, Alan Morrison. Go to the website, enterprisechina.com, and yeah, keep in touch with him. He's got some good stuff going on. Remember, guys, $1 million book will lead to $1 million life. Right on.